Hello, welcome to Ecotactics Conversation series on environmental research practices hosted by Generation, focusing on exploratory methodologies for fieldwork, ecopedagogy, and environmental literacy. This program weaves together a network of practitioners who have been experimenting with novel approaches for ecological research, crossing the fields of art and sound anthropology, media studies, hydrofeminism, and pedagogical activism. Past sessions included sound anthropologist Stephen Feld, forensic architect Godofredo Pereira, scuba diver and media theorist Melody Jew, and hydrofeminist and educator Astrida Neymanis. All the recordings are available online on Generation website and YouTube channel and serve as a resource for future study. For our last session of this cycle today, I have invited a very special guest whose work I've been following throughout the years, kanngieser, who is a geographer, sound artist, and Marie Curie Research Fellow at Geography at Royal Holloway University in London. They work through listening and attunement to approach the relations between people, place, and ecologies, combining oral testimony, poetry, and voice with hyper-detailed soundscapes and field recordings to create immersive installations and radio art pieces. They are the author of Experimental Politics and the Making of Worlds, and Between Sound and Silence, Listening Towards Environmental Relations, forthcoming, and have co-founded the Institute for Freshwater Fish Futures and work extensively in collaboration with Pacific storytellers, artists, advocates, and grassroots organizers. Thank you, Amar. It's a great pleasure to have you today and share your path and your journey that is quite transdisciplinary, much in the line of our topics, and we look very much forward to our exchange and to welcome you here.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and I look forward to our conversation. Just going to begin by sharing my screen. That was a very comprehensive introduction. My name is kanngieser, and I'm a white German first-generation Australian geographer and sound artist with a background in performance studies and sociology, and later for my PhD work in geography and communication studies. So I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, how I came to do the work that I do, some of the main concerns of the work that I do, and the methods that I use, and look at very briefly at a few of the audio works that I've been producing over the last few years. And all of the audio works and the things that I'm talking about are available on my website, amkanngieser.com. So I began working with sound and, working with electronics and stuff from a very young age. I grew up on a boat. This is the boat that I grew up on, where my parents migrated from Germany to Australia, and we lived in the Pacific. My parents were sailors. And so I grew up with a very vibrant soundscape, I suppose you'd call it. The first sounds I heard were the ocean and ham radio, because my father communicated a lot with other sailors, and he was also an electrician. So because of his training and his background, I had a lot of support in learning how to work with electronics and building radios and understanding radio and sound from a very, very young age. When I was about 6, we moved off the boat onto a small island where our neighbors were also German migrants, an elderly German couple who had survived the Holocaust and migrated to Australia. And the elderly gentleman was a political dissident and also a composer, and he'd been composing sound for radio and early television and things like that before he'd moved to Australia, and then also in Australia. And he became a grandfather to me. And so from a very young age with him also, he would get me to record stories and poetry where he would put sound effects to and would play music while I was speaking. And so this was the kind of environment that I grew up in. And I mention this environment because I think it's very important for me to situate the work that I do in this kind of context of growing up on a boat on an island, surrounded by people where there was a great attention, not only to sounds and to the kind of auditory landscape, but also very much a concern with what it means to be foreign, different questions around post-war politics, enforced migration and displacement, and also surviving quite extensive trauma. And so all of these things kind of came together for me in particular kinds of ways. And it really makes me think, and it has always really made me think about sound and one's relationship to place and one's understanding of how one fits into place or how one navigates place in particular kinds of ways, because I think it's very important, and I'm going to talk about this more extensively, listening is something that a lot of people place a lot of emphasis on and has gotten a lot of attention, particularly over the last few years. And I think it's very, very important to think about how our social, political, economic contexts, how the environments that we are surrounded in really affects how we listen and what we hear and what we make from what we listen. So there's this idea that listening is a very universal thing and that we all kind of listen in the same ways. But I want to just quickly bring in a very nice quote from sound studies theorist Jennifer Stoever, because I think this encapsulates the problems with this very much. So she says, a listening subject is comprised of auditory information processed through interactive and intersectional psychological filters that include the habits, assumptions, desires, and repulsions shaped by gender, class, national, regional, and linguistic identities. So, I think when we talk about listening, for the most part, the idea that everybody listens differently it sounds obvious. One would not assume, that a person that has grown up in my position would listen exactly the same as a person that has grown up, somewhere else in the world under very different conditions. So it makes sense that sound and listening is experienced very differently by different people. And I want to also clarify quickly at this point that by listening, I don't mean just like listening with the ears. For me, when I talk about listening, I mean more broadly as like sensing the world, attuning to the world and noticing the world. So, I think even though logically we might understand that everybody would listen differently and these different things that have happened in our life impacts how we listen, but saying this on a very felt level, we often assume that everybody listens the same way as us and derives the same understanding from things. And I think that this is really clearly indicated in the fact that we, often get hurt when there's ideas around misunderstanding, things get misconstrued. There's still a lot of feelings that are involved there when we expect someone to be listening and hearing the same as us, and then something shows us that that's not true. And so I think that there's this kind of tension here where there's this idea that we understand we all listen differently, we all hear the world in different ways and interpret the world in different ways. However, we still universalize it and we still think that there is one ear and that there is one listening body. Okay, so this is something that is very, very crucial to the work that I do. And I'm going to come back to this again. So I just want to kind of hold that thought there. I think it's just what all of my work comes from is thinking about this confluence of listening, of sound, of stories, and of place, and how I build those relationships through all of my work and how I build those relationships in my everyday life. And thinking very much about what it means to listen and what it means to produce knowledge out of what we hear. Okay. And then to think about the stories that we tell about what we hear and how those stories kind of make confirmations of what we already imagine of the world. And these are all really important questions to think about because, again, as I said before, especially within feminist philosophies and, environmental humanities and disciplines that kind of are thinking about the environment and the arts and interdisciplinarity and things like this, and particularly embodiment. There is a lot of emphasis here on listening, and listening is often not interrogated, particularly in terms of the knowledge that we produce from what we hear. So the work that I'm going to talk a bit about today, my Climates of Listening project, which I began in about 2014, was really founded in this idea of like, what stories are told, what stories are heard, who are they told by and how, and really importantly as well to the work that I do, what stories don't get told, what stories don't get heard, and very crucially, what stories are withheld, what stories are not for everybody to hear, what stories are not for me to hear, and all these issues around what is heard, what is unheard, what is misheard, and then what is made out of those hearings. So as you already mentioned in my bio a little bit, my practice comes from my background in both being a sound artist and a builder of radios, as well as a geographer. And my geographical work over the last decade or so has really been oriented towards thinking about geographical questions that are articulated through sonic methods. And very much that includes like building soundscapes, creating works for radio, building audio works, as well as running radio building workshops with people, podcast making workshops, and trainings and things like that, and also exhibiting sound art over the last decade or two. In my geographical research, what is really, really important to me and has always been important to me, because, you know, my background is very strongly informed by anarchist and autonomous Marxist politics. I've always been very interested in how people organize together to create the worlds that they want to live in. So how people organize together towards self-determination, toward their own liberation. And within that, I'm very interested in particularly how people support and care for one another outside of any kind of state or national or governmental support or intervention. So how people really relate to one another within different understandings of community, to take care of each other and to support each other, and also how this connects to the environments in which we live. So how, for instance, environmental conditions affect the ways that people collaborate and communicate with one another. And I call what I do really, I guess, sonic ethnography, because my work is very much as an ethnographer. That's my training, is in ethnography, and all of my work is really built on relations that I have with people, and it all comes from those kinds of relations and practices together. So it's a very, very important part of what I do. So, as I said, I began Climates of Listening in around 2014. And within the frame of this project, I work with predominantly women, Pacific women, queer and transgender people who are organizers and scholars and work in different kinds of community level projects to amplify movements for self-determination and liberation in the face of rampant resource extraction, environmental racism, and ecocide in the Pacific. My stake in this personally is that, firstly, you know, I spent a lot of time in the Pacific, in various Pacific islands when I was growing up, living on the boat. And also I have been long aware and in admiration of the work that Pacific, particularly LGBTQIA Pacific organizers, have been doing around climate change and gender justice in the Pacific, and had the opportunity to work with some of the groups that I'd been really kind of looking at for quite a while, like in admiration of the work that they were doing, particularly organizing in the wake of natural disasters and, you know, where there was no kind of economic or social support from governments and things like that. So this is how I kind of came into this work. My personal stakes were always at the front and quite important to me to begin relationally in that kind of way. So when I began this work, what was a priority for me was really tracing out the long and ongoing lineages and impacts of historical colonization in the region, which was also pushed through, like largely done as well by Germany, which was very, very interesting for me, given my history as a German person and also an Australian person, was looking as well as those kind of colonial legacies from European colonization in the Pacific and neocolonialism, of which part Australia plays a very large role in the region, and trying to really show how the Pacific as a current environmental frontline has really been tied to, you know, hundreds of years of Anglo-European environmental racism that has been apparent in the region. So looking at the climactic impacts that are happening now and seeing them within this larger lineage, because I think it's very important not to disentangle those things, because obviously things that are happening now are very much based on impacts of colonization, things like resource extraction, damage to lands through tourism and things like that. So, not to even talk about, the histories of missionization and the impacts on cultures of that, and all the other ways that colonialism continues to unfold socially and environmentally. So, just to give some context for people who might not be familiar with the Pacific region, the Pacific is considered one of the world's front lines of climate catastrophe. It's very susceptible to a number of different devastating climatic changes and environmental changes, including sea level rise, intensified cyclones, intensified floods, droughts, coastal erosion, coral bleaching, tsunamis. So really there are a number of different impacts that people are facing simultaneously, which means also that communities are being forced to be very attentive and, I guess, foreground mitigation strategies, because there is really not, I would say there's really not that much movement that's happening on a global scale of, mitigating the disasters that are happening or changing the structures and systems that are causing these disasters to happen. So people are forced to adapt and forced to build mitigation strategies on a community level. So these kinds of environmental challenges are going on at the same time as things like health epidemics, which are always tied to environmental disaster, underemployment and economic precarity. There are all of these issues, geopolitical issues that are coming together in a very acute way across the Pacific. And because of this, the Pacific Islands, of which there are many, it's a very enormous region, are held up as case studies in vulnerability in a lot of climate literature. And one of the problems with this idea of vulnerability is that, so there's a very famous Pacific scholar and educator, Epeli Hauofa, who talks about the way that the Pacific is seen as, these islands in a far sea, which focuses on the landmass only rather than a sea of islands. And it's really trying to work against this idea of the Pacific as remote, as marginal, and seeing it as this enormous landmass of people that have lived there for a very, very long time and are very, very self-determined and very adept at looking after their environments and their livelihoods. So what my aim with this project really is to expand the kinds of narrow definitions that people often will use around the Pacific, either as, climate heroes or climate victims. That's the way that a lot of frontline communities get narrated in a lot of academic literature and within the media. So to move outside of these definitions of resilience and vulnerability, that the region really does get pushed through governmental NGO policy discourse, popular discourse, media and academic discourse, and to showcase really the various ways, the very nuanced ways that people live with these kinds of catastrophic events and processes on a day-to-day level, to really look at the everyday ways that people are living within the region, and how people attend to what is fundamentally ecocide and has been for a very long time. So I moved to Fiji in 2017 and began working with a number of different groups recording oral testimonies, which is basically audio recorded interviews, poetry, songs, spoken word, a various range of articulations that people wanted to record with me. So I was recording oral testimonies and also consulting with archival recordings to understand people's lived experiences. And Over the course of the project, I think I conducted over 150 interviews with people in Fiji, in Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, Nauru, and Papua New Guinea. And these were all places that I was invited to come in and speak with people about what their experiences were. And at the same time as doing the oral testimonies, I was also doing field recordings or audio recordings of the environments that people were in, because I felt, particularly given Pacific culture and Pacific philosophies and ideas around environment and human entanglement and interrelation, it felt appropriate for me to center the environments that people were also coming from and living within. So I put together these oral testimonies and the field recordings because it didn't feel appropriate to pull them apart or to act like there could be one without the other. It always has to be an integration in the work that I do. So that was really important to me. And the idea that I'm really working with in thinking about this is what a close collaborator and friend of mine, Métis philosopher Zoe Todd, calls kin study. And I'll just define this. So Zoe calls a kin study as thoughtful, careful, and plural hyperlocal ethnographies to counter the ways that the overwhelmingly white, Eurocentric academic and global policy discourses of global warming erase the local specific experiences of devastation faced by marginalized communities. So we wrote a paper about kin studies and some of this work called From Environmental Case Study to Environmental Kin Study. And this for us really kind of attends or is a way to articulate how we try to attend to the separations between that case studies in a very classical sense insert between people and places and the ways that we think about them and the relations that exist there. So to give some grounding to everything that I've been talking about, I want to just quickly go over two key themes in the work that I do and talk about them a bit in relationship to audio pieces that have come out over the last couple of years. And as I said, all of the works that I'm talking about and all of my work is available on my website. So if people want to listen to those, they are there. But two of the main themes that I've been working with in this project and working with for quite a long time actually are incommensurability and relationality. And I'm going to talk a little bit about both of those now. So this is a video here of a very beautiful mountaintop, Mount Batalamu in Fiji. And I wanted to show this because for me, it really encapsulates a lot about when I think about incommensurability or an inability to draw comparison or measure, which is a very important concept and a very important idea for me to work with on a number of levels, particularly thinking about my inability, and I think many people's inabilities to understand climatic catastrophe and to, I suppose, to work through it in some way and to understand as well our place within that and the impacts of that on a lot of communities. So in 2018, I was commissioned by Radio Reina Sofia in collaboration with 4 Fijian poets and artists to create an audio work called In the Eye of the Storm, which was based on the poets writing poetry about the impact of Cyclone Winston, which happened in 2016 and was the first Category 5 cyclone to hit the shore in the Southern Hemisphere. And so I worked with 4 poets, Atueta Rambuka, Christelle Lavaki, Amalia Rigby, and Peter Sapelli, and they all told stories about their experiences of Winston. And, you know, there's a lot of information about Cyclone Winston available online if people want to look at that. It was an enormously devastating cyclone. Many people were killed through the cyclone and so many people were displaced. It had an enormous economic and social impact on Fiji that is still resonating today. So the devastation of that cyclone, I don't think can be overstated. And the way that the poets approached this were from very different positions, you know, and again, this is available on my website as well, I think, as a transcript, so people are able to access that to maybe better understand what I'm talking about. But, you know, a lot of the themes that they talked about was the non-linearity of time, the way that the devastation of Cyclone Winston connected to past horrific cyclones, the way that memory operates, cultural memory, and also global collective memory operates to forget instances of disaster, the kind of living memory of grief and trauma. I mean, a lot of it was around, you know, how to hold grief, how to hold the enormity of something that cannot really be, I guess, encapsulated or thought of in any kind of whole way, how to sit with that, you know, and also the different ways that cultural stories and the importance of these things change over time, particularly through the influence of Western culture and globalization, you know, and the damage that has affected on communities as well. And what was really important for me, because they wrote their pieces and then I kind of wrote around their pieces, and we worked on that together to see how everything would kind of fit in one way. But what was really important for me was how to connect these everyday impacts that they were talking about to these histories of colonization, to draw out how what was experienced in that moment was very much connected to what had begun long before, you know, and to tie together how those Anglo-European ways of understanding the world and separating the world apart continue to have effects that are often, you know, feel imperceptible or are often even hard to kind of put a finger on. They're just so saturated through absolutely everything. And thinking about how the scale of colonization and the scale of those effects are immense, you know, there are no words to describe it. So really what we were working with was the unspeakability of these kinds of events and the kinds of chasms that they leave and how people, I suppose, respond to those. And one of the things that was very influential for me in this work, you know, because a lot of my work is also about silence and what can't be said and also what is not mine to hear. And I write a lot about that. One of the ways that I came through this was through the brilliant work of Professor Uni-Isi Nabobo-Baba, who wrote an exceptional monograph called On Knowing and Learning, an Indigenous Fijian Approach, where she talks, she does a kind of ethnographic study of different kinds of silence and talks about a pedagogy of silence as a pedagogy of deep engagement. So different kinds of cultural and environmental silences. And through conversation with people in different parts across the Pacific, particularly in Kiribati, I learned that, you know, these ideas of silence, these taxonomies of silence, these multitudes of understandings of silence extended across many, many different places. And, you know, I thought that this was also very important for me to kind of understand to understand in the context as well of silence as refusal and the ways that silence has been taken up as refusal by many Indigenous and First Nations communities, as so many authors have already written about, like, for instance, like Audra Simpson, Aileen Morton-Robinson, Eve Tuck and Kay Wayne Yang. There's just a lot of Indigenous writers and Aboriginal writers that have written about, you know, silence and refusal and how these things work together. So, you know, this idea of silence, these ideas of incommensurability, of what I cannot understand, and also of what is not mine to understand, were very, very crucial to how I started to frame myself as a listener and the work that I do in terms of listening, because this really, I would say, invited me to think about listening in terms of humility, to think about listening in terms of consent and permission, to think very much around, you know, what is inaudible and what is not audible for me, as I keep talking about, to also think about, to very much interrogate also what I hear and how I hear in certain ways, and what I am able to know and understand, and how much that affects what I draw from what I listen to. And I want to just quickly say here that there was a comment that brilliant scholar and poet, Kiribati scholar and poet, Teviriki Terero said to me, which I value very much and take with me every single day. He said to me, 2 ears, 1 mouth, don't talk so much. Learn to listen more, not only to hear, but to also develop another thing, and that is to be able to interpret. These things are very different and they occur at different levels. And the hearing and the interpretation of sound is very much part of our world. So I think really by having these lessons and by having these instructions that I was given, because I spent a lot of time talking to Pacific elders about silence and about listening, and was given a lot of instructions and a lot of guidance around how to do my work, which has been the foundational basis of everything that I do, was taking that guidance and that instruction. And I'm extraordinarily grateful for the opportunities that people gave to me in telling me the things that they told me. What it's really helped me to do is to kind of start to compose, I suppose, what I'd call an ethics of attunement that is appropriate specifically to the work that I do and how I do it. So, I wouldn't really say that the work that I do is necessarily transferable. I don't know. I was given very specific instructions and guidance for me from people about how I work and the work that I do. And so this is always a question that I get asked is, well, how do you ask for consent? How do you ask for permission? And, it's a very hard thing to answer because it's a very personal thing. It's a very personal thing that I feel has, been developed over many, many, many years, and asking many questions and making many mistakes and having very, very firm guidance from the people that I work with as well around this. So, the way I try to communicate it, though, is, again, thinking about how we position listening to understand it as more than just oral hearing, as I said before, to really think about it as sensing, attuning, and noticing, and to really, for ourselves, to take the time to figure out what attunement actually means, how to attune to particular environments, and, how to attune to, again, what is not for us. What is not for me, what is not for me at that time, what I am able to grasp and what is incommensurable. So the theme of incommensurability has played an enormous role in everything that I do, and I think that this is really the core of the work that I do, is how to be present with and how to listen to things that are incommensurable, and to also know when it's just not mine to hear. So on top of this, all of these things that I'm talking about, I want to emphasize that, listening is a very situated and embodied process. How we listen is entirely contingent on how our body feels, where we are, the possibilities that we have for safety, where we are, how we are in a moment hugely affects our capacity to hear, our capacity to be present in a space, and the stories that we derive from what we're hearing. And this, honestly, it changes moment to moment, and I think one of the things that get not spoken about in listening work is how difficult listening and being present is. I run a lot of listening workshops with people, and consistently the feedback is that it's very hard to sit and listen, even for 3 minutes, to just sit and listen for 3 minutes, I have now a decades-long practice of listening meditation, which I do more or less every day, and have over time been able to develop the capacity to do the listening work that I do. And I can still say to this day that is the hardest thing that I can do. It is so difficult to actually be present and to try to listen with openness and to try to catch myself when I'm making assumptions, or when I start to feel bored, or when I start to feel tired, or I can't be bothered anymore, I'm disengaged. There are all of these things that for me in my work, I have to be aware of when I'm undertaking my work, particularly doing interviews with people or field recordings, where I have to be very aware of my relation to the place and to the people and to myself, and to be very honest, very, very honest and very observant of those kinds of things. So I think that's, that really kind of brings me to a second very important theme in the work that I do, which is relationality, which is how we relate to each other and how we relate to the world. And I'm not just talking about here the current connections of relationality, but more in the sense of understanding time as nonlinear, understanding the past always in the present, always in the future, that these things are always entangled and are always co-constitutive and co-informational in all kinds of ways that we can't even, I think can't even imagine. So as I mentioned, as I was coming into this work as a white first generation Australian of German heritage, I wanted to find ways that I could address and analyze my own complicity and my own lineages in the work that I do, and to really kind of, not to center this, but to certainly be very honest about it and very attentive about it. And it was fantastic for me because in a lot of my interviews and interactions with people across the Pacific, people are very open about this, right? And it's very obvious. Like, there are so many white academics that go to the Pacific to talk about climate change that it was a real relief to be able to say, yeah, this is who I am. This is where I'm coming from. These are what my stakes are. This is what I bring with me. This is what I can do. This is what I can't do. And to actually be very, very upfront about that from the very beginning. I think that there's no point in trying to hide things or trying to lie. I think the best approach is always to just state very clearly, this is what I bring with me. And I understand what I bring with me. I'm not going to try to obfuscate that or to pretend otherwise. There are such devastating power relations across the region with Anglo-European colonizers within the region that I think, putting those things on the table at the beginning to really kind of understand my own complicity in both, and the lineages that I carry in ongoing and historical dispossession and profiteering of Pacific resources, and how to, I suppose, acknowledge that and also enact respectful and mutual and reciprocitous relationships with people, that is driven by, to ensure that my work is also driven by people's concerns and what people see that I can bring to them, to really think about, what do I actually contribute? What is the point of my work? How do I reallocate resources? What am I doing here? I think is a very important question to always ask. Why am I here? Do I need to be here? To always think about that relationality. So, in the work that I do, I work with a lot of Indigenous Pacific Islanders and also a lot with other Indigenous people. And I think it's really important as well. There's this real kind of, I suppose, enthusiasm at the moment, particularly amongst white and non-Indigenous academics around Indigenous approaches to relationality and kinship and land. And I think what's very important as well for me is to say, that is not mine. That's not mine. I have to figure out what is mine. But in taking up Indigenous ontologies as my own, or creating some kind of fetish out of them, or trying to be particular ways, is not appropriate. And to really think about where lines of appropriation fall and what is mine to do and what is mine to kind of, where is my position in this, and to always be very, very careful around not being appropriative, not kind of thinking, oh, okay, well, because Indigenous people do this, then I can do it. Absolutely not. So this is very much part of the work that I've been doing. And I think, to really consider who I am and who we are, who the we, that is the listeners, are. And for me, I tried to thematize this a lot in a work that I did for the Art Centre in Melbourne called Submersion. And this is a photo of me recording the piece. So the piece came from the idea that it's very hard for people who are at non-climate frontlines to really understand what climate frontlines are going through. And I made this piece to basically kind of say, right, well, 3-meter sea level rise, this is what it would look like in Melbourne. And it came very much from my own experience of an inundation event while I was in Tarawa in Kiribati, where the water rose and completely inundated the road. It completely inundated a village that we were staying near. And I noticed that people were kind of not batting an eye. Like, there was kids playing in the inundation. There were people playing with a dog. There were people sitting on the side of the road eating ice creams, while myself and my friend who was there with me were like, oh my God, like what is happening? You know, there's just water coming in everywhere. So, you know, this piece really talked about what it felt like to be an observer of this kind of event and how that might translate to a different context in an Australian context. And so that is also, I think, available to listen to online. I'm just very aware of the time.
We don't have to be sharp on the hour.
Okay.
So according to your rhythm as well, we can keep going.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I'm very much almost close to finish because I would really like to talk about some of these things more with you. But yeah, so I really, in that piece, really wanted to think about, you know, what does it viscerally feel like to experience a flooding event? What does it mean to experience when that is in one's home? And what does it mean to experience when one perceives that as something that is far away, that is not kind of related to where we are? And again, like, I think I was really trying to think through this idea of, you know, what does it mean to be an outsider listening in? What do I bring with me when I listen? What assumptions do I make? You know, what impacts does my presence really have on a particular place that I'm in? So this all kind of brings me back to this thing that I was talking about before, about this idea that listening is kind of taken up in a lot of ways as this kind of benign universal event, that we all listening in the same ways, you know, that we all kind of experience the world in the same ways, that we, even though we know it's untrue, that we have these assumptions about how other people experience the world based on how we listen, you know. And there's been a lot of work written on this. Dylan Robinson has, a couple of years ago, put out a fantastic book called Hungry Listening, where he talks about settler colonizer listening, and he talks about listening as, particularly listening as certainty, as settler colonizer kind of logics of violence and of ownership and possession. You know, so I think there's a lot of work around this to draw on that people are really trying to thematize at the moment. And so I suppose with my work, I'm trying to intervene, I suppose, in some of the ways that listening gets positioned as this kind of general good thing, like I'm listening and learning, you know, listening as a benign kind of thing, or listening also as a somehow radical or political activity in itself, which it is not, you know. And so I think, yeah, that's what I'd really like to kind of continue to talk about, is the ways that listening is left uninterrogated, you know, despite the fact that, you know, we have such strong cultures of interrogating visuality and the gaze, you know, the idea that the ear is somehow still universalized, you know, and where these ideas come from as well. And, you know, I think Sylvia Winter is very good to read on this, about ethno-class man and the Eurocentric body and the idea of what constitutes, you know, a body that is being dismantled all the time. So anyway, I'll leave it there. I have a lot to say on these themes, but I'll leave it there for the moment.
Thank you, Amr. Very beautiful thoughts, very urgent thoughts. And it's very nice to see where the journey starts, actually, and also where the imagination of the media comes from a direct contact with the space, no, with the boats, with the radio, with the circuits, with the voices, with the soundscapes. So I really like to trace back how people, you know, have their intuitions on their research, and how the methods are always embodied on the first place and come from that very located, situated perspective. So it's very nice to open up a bit of your path, which I know is long, and there are many projects and avenues and collaborators, so many stories to be told, you know. Our stories and our experiences of listening are never only our own, they're shared in different ways, no, or woven in these huge listening tapestries. So it's very good to have the opportunity to have you here as well, because cycling back to Stephen Feld, who was in Papua for, I don't know, since the 70s, and developed anthropology of sound. And now we come to sonic ethnography, so different positions and different points of questioning as well in the, I'm not going to call it the colonial, but in the questioning of the colonial journey where we are. I have to say that I resonate with with things that you share, because I do deep sea mining activism since over 7 years. So I'm extremely connected with activists in the Pacific and with the resistance on site. So as soon as I heard about your research project there, I was like, fantastic. I wish I was there as well to learn from this experience. So I really take, I don't know how to say, a very open curiosity of receiving these lessons, from the elders on the ground, from the collectives on the ground, on how to arrive to these sites. And for me, it's always so important, as well as somebody who does field recordings and many other practices, but how we arrive as listeners and from where, and it's never neutral. So I really take also this guidance and teachings from you, and really thank you for opening this space of these ethics of attunement. Maybe a question that I would like to pose, because there are different resonances here, is how do you think that sonic modes of knowing and the tools that we use can contribute to an anti-extractive future? Because we're always, connected to these front lines, to these conflicts. But how can we also open spaces otherwise?
I mean, I think, and I would always say this, being informed by my own past and the own values and positions that I hold. But I remember I was at a conference, and there was an elder Papua New Guinean man there, and I was talking about listening, and he got up and he said, you know what, what you're saying is absolutely true. The problem is that people don't listen. Like we have said again and again what we need from people. We have made our position very clear. We're communicating very, very clearly, and people aren't listening. And I think this is one of the exact problems around positioning listening in itself as a radical activity. It is not. All of the work that I do is very firmly driven by principles of self-determination on every level, of projects that Indigenous people are pushing for, like land back, of reparations, of material reparations, and that very laborious and ongoing political work of actually making sure that people have the resources that are theirs, that they are stewards of, that they are in their lands, and making sure that those things are materially happening, right? So I think the question of how to be non-extractive is to materially be non-extractive. It's to make sure that even on levels like people get paid properly for the work that they do, with all of the people I work with that are collaborators, every time I get a commission for something, everybody gets paid the same amount, like everything is split. And I will always pay people for their time, for their interviews, for everything of theirs that I use. I will always name people. I will always put people in positions as people will take on the positions that they actually legitimately have as co-producers. It's really important to name and to pay and to redistribute resources over and over and over again. And I think, I saw a little while ago that Steve Feld actually set up a fund for people that he was working with. And I thought everybody should literally do this, because one thing that people do not talk about is money, is material redistribution of wealth. And I know that for a lot of academics and artists, the argument is always like, well, we don't have the money ourselves. And I always think, well, then if we don't have the money ourselves, we should not be going into places and exploiting and extracting from people. It's as simple as that. Is it really necessary if you don't have a material way to actually reimburse people for their time and their labor? That's just a very minimal basic thing. So I think on that level already, that's already something that's a very material thing that people can do. I mean, I think also materially supporting, and supporting in all different ways that people can, the campaigns and projects that people are working on themselves within those regions. So one of the groups that I work with, Pang in Fiji, they have for a very long time been doing anti-deep seabed mining activism. And so what can I do to support them, or other groups like, One Solwara and things like that, is redistribute money, work with people, bring visibility to the stuff that people are doing, and put people in control of the narratives that get told, step away, really just, bring the opportunities and step back, you know. Also things like making sure that if there are skills that I have, like with radio production and stuff, like I run workshops for people all the time. You know, if people want a podcasting workshop, they'll get it. And I'll make sure that people have got recording devices and microphones and absolutely everything, you know, and not policing how people do things, like just giving skills, giving resources and going hands off. You know, so I think on very basic relational levels, that's already how to think about, you know, okay, if I interview someone or I talk to someone and they tell me what they need from me, what I can do to be non-extractive is to listen to them, actually listen and actually implement what they've asked me. You know, that is really somehow sounds like a basic first step, but in again and again, when I spoke to people, they did not have that. You know, the amount of people that will go in from overseas, come in as foreigners and say, well, I want to hear your story. I want to do this. I want to do that. And then they're just gone. There is no ongoing relation. There is no ongoing redistribution. It's just someone makes their career then, you know. And so I think like, if we really are committed to being non-extractive, then listening and implementing what people ask of us is the bare minimum of what we can do. You know, and really, as I said before as well, really asking yourself, do I need to be here? Like, is this really my place? Is this really necessary? And I ask myself this a lot of times, and there are many places where I do not need to be. You know, like that is just the blunt answer. I don't need to be there. I'm not bringing anything useful. You know, like I am just being extractive. And so I will leave, you know, and that has consequences and costs, of course. But if we really, truly want to think about this, then that is what we need to do. And we need to be supporting campaigns for self-determination and land back in every single way that we possibly can, you know. So I think that's, you know, I think there's a rhetoric around listening that makes it more morally valuable than what it truly is. Because I think oftentimes the behavior and the actual change does not come with the act of listening. It comes with implementing what we are asked.
Yeah, I think it's a very valuable contribution. I just wanted to clarify that I didn't think you're an extractive researcher.
Oh, no.
Okay.
No, that's not how I took it at all. No,
yeah.
I have this conversation with many people all the time, you know,
okay.
and
Me too.
Zoe and I also talked about it quite a lot when people were worried about, you know, with COVID and not being able to travel and simply not having the resources to be able to travel, because a lot of people want to do interviews, you know, with people on the front lines, but they can't get there, which is absolutely fair. You know, I am enormously privileged to be able to have had the opportunities for funding that I have had, you know, and I am, you know, that's why I make so much of my work available for free, you know, publicly available, because the opportunities that I have had, not that many people, you know, get. And the thing that we always came back to as well is that you can be in good relation with people remotely as well. You know, like there is a wealth of information online that people have produced themselves. Like, you know, there is Facebook groups, there's social media, there's everything. You can be in good relation without being there. And you can also be contributing financially or in whatever ways possible to the people that you work with, you know, particularly for students who won't be able to access the money necessary for doing that kind of ethnographic work. Like there are so many ways to be in good relation. There are so many ways to not be extractive. And it all involves listening and communicating with the people that you're working with and getting in touch and saying, you know, hey, what do you need from me? Like, I would like to do this work. What do you need from me?
Mm-hmm. Totally. I resonate, and I also think of some contexts that I work with that are quite problematic and traumatic and distant from my experience. However, I experienced partially, such as the petrochemical corridor in the Mississippi River, where I was recording sound. And I always go back to thinking, how can my work or contribution bring a sense of reciprocity that is honest and that is also indebted to the many encounters I had, while acknowledging that I will never understand the full experience of this hydrotrauma, this geotrauma. So how this humbleness as somebody who comes as a researcher that establishes their field, that senses the ground, but that always knows that sensing is partial. So I also think about this, and I really enjoyed in your talk or your presentation, your offering today, how you also speak of this accessing the longue durée, the longue durée of the colonial inheritance, but also how sound can travel transtemporally in a way and offer us small entrances into, the layered presence or many pasts and futures where our bodies are vehicles of a longer political project. So I always come to try to speculate further and write a little bit of the relation between sound and repair, or listening and grief and trauma. Knowing that listening, as you also said, is never only from the ears. I write about it as a somatic listening, a sensing that comes from the whole body. So how we register different sorts of frequencies. So I would like to just ask you to riff off a little bit out of these concerns.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been a lot of work being done around bioacoustics, and how to very materially measure the impacts of particular kinds of, industrial destruction on environments through acoustic environments. Bernie Krause has been doing this for a very, very long time, and there are a lot of people working within these fields. I think that's been quite informative for me, and I think, like I would say to this, one really important moment for me was when I went to Nauru. And when I first got there, I noticed that there were a lot of German words in Nauruan, and it was a really intense moment for me, because I thought, like, I knew that Germany had colonized Nauru, but to actually hear the German words that had been incorporated into the language or forced into the language was a very different visceral feeling. Like for me, that to hear my mother tongue in that kind of context was a moment that really has stayed in my body for many, many years, and then talking to people about that, like talking to one of the people that I was working with there, and she was like, well, what did you expect? And I was like, well, yeah, I mean, this is a very true point. What did I expect? I didn't expect that, but I should have understood, same in Papua New Guinea, the influence of German language through German colonization within the region. So, I think like there are these very visceral moments that have occurred for me in my work. Similarly, again, in Nauru, is doing recordings at the phosphate mines, and I was invited there by the Nauruan government to actually look at all of the different kinds of impacts of climate change on the island in a very holistic kind of way, and how that had been affected by the phosphate mines, which were also, as Katerina Tewa writes about brilliantly in her book, Consuming Ocean Island, really the foundation for Australian and New Zealand agricultural production. So the impact of actually listening at these places and being able to viscerally experience that history, like that knowledge of that history, and then being able to hear it, I think is, for me at least, and again, it is felt, like it is, I feel it all through my body, it changes who I am. Like I carry it with me everywhere that I go, still to this day. And I think that's something for me that is very crucial. And that's why I do this work, is because those things really stay there. And I think, there's a possibility, obviously there are a lot of things that can't be heard. And I think that that's also something very interesting, where people are trying to grapple with things like sonification of scientific data and stuff to try to make things heard. And, I often, like, I love the experimental form of that. I really love the kind of idea of experimenting with different forms of climate communication. I often wonder, like, how they are received. I think sometimes there's still this idea of it as a very, like, novel, and sometimes I feel like the sonifications themselves don't quite maybe convey the gravity of what's being heard, or I also wonder about, putting it into this kind of performance format as this kind of entertainment, like how to actually, how does one actually translate the long timescales of devastation, and also the complexity of that devastation, which oftentimes we have no idea about whatsoever. It's impossible to know on how many scales this devastation is occurring, like we'll never know. We know maybe big things like massive extinction events, but even so, there are so many things that we have absolutely no awareness of, and I say we, I mean globally, I mean scientists, I mean academics, I mean don't know. And so, I'm always really curious about how that gets formulated and how people are trying to work with this through sound. And at the same time, often wonder, like, is this ours to hear? Like, is this something that I ought to be hearing? Like, when I put my microphone somewhere, is this somewhere where I should be putting a microphone? Like, is this welcomed? Do I actually, I'm just shoving something into some place where it doesn't belong, And so I think about these things a lot, is like, what does it mean to kind of listen to long durations? And what does it mean to draw the information out of it that I'm perceiving? What does it mean to really want to make sense of something that is not sensical, or at least not comprehensible by me? My body can't hold the immensity of what I'm hearing or what I'm thinking through, And so, yeah, there are a lot of questions for me around how we do this, which I think is good. I have no answers. I only have small attempts at a lot of questions.
Maybe as a final question and curiosity, because we're getting to the end of our time together, at least for now, is maybe something that stays with me, how to incorporate unsound or the unheard when we are trying to make sound composition. Because, for example, this might sound abstract, but I walk into a landscape where there is biodiversity loss or there's extraction going. And I always wonder, what am I not hearing, or what is gone? What leaves a resonance still in the histories of listening around me, but is not there? So I wonder how we can work with this space of the unsound. And I try to write about it, and I always get puzzled and get into the, this kind of after images that come. But it's something that stays with me as a listener. I work a lot on imaginary sound as well as a tool for thinking about environments. So I was curious what you think about this.
I mean, I think I don't know. I remember trying to incorporate silence into audio works. And I remember for one radio piece I did, they said, you can't have such a long silence. People will think that the piece is broken, or that the station is broken. Like, you can't do that. And I really had a long conversation with the producer, because I was like, no, but it's very necessary. And he was like, no, you have to have something. There needs to be something audible so that people know that it's still working, that it's still going. And I thought that's really stayed with me, because I always try to figure out how to incorporate that silence, or that kind of like, what on the one hand feels like a lack, but is also an absolute excess. Like in most of the work that I do, silence is like excessive, particularly in interviews with people. When someone is silent, it's so full of things that could be said, and that's why I find silence so important in what I do, because it's never a lack. I always feel that silence is there are so many things that it's impossible to kind of put it into one, and so I don't know, like, I try to experiment with these things, materially kind of translating them. And I have no idea. I don't know how to write about silence. I don't know how to create silent, like, I don't, aside from literally putting a gap, I'm really not sure, because it's that incommensurability, it's maybe not something that can be written or that can be translated. And maybe that's the whole point of it, and that's why I always keep coming back. I'm always saying, there are things that are just not for me, that are just not, I don't have the competency. I don't know. I just don't know, and I think that's what I love so much about not knowing, and to be able to say, I have no idea. This has been something that I've been thinking through for so many years now, and I still have nothing. So I don't know. I don't know, I don't know how to portray or represent anything along those lines. I just know how to maybe find some edges. I would say that's what I am good at doing, is finding edges and finding boundaries, and then from those edges and boundaries, working toward something else, and kind of doing a very I suppose, like careful and slow choreography to constantly feel out how those edges and boundaries might be moving, where something might shift, you know, particularly in doing interviews with people, you know, like where something changes, you know, where that particular energetic resonance might change into something else, you know, and I think that's a constant interplay and a constant kind of dance there, you know, and so that's the only way really. But to actually, I don't know, to actually be with that silence, you know, again, I don't know how to translate it. I can be with it. I can be in it. I can feel it. I don't know how to communicate it. And maybe that's how it's meant to be.
Well, thank you, Amar. Thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to hear more about your work. And I want to thank all the team at Generation for allowing the cycle to come to be. Follow our YouTube channel if you want to listen back and dive into the research, know more. There will be a couple of links. And yeah, we'll be in touch. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for inviting me.
Have a great day.
Bye.